Great to have you all here. Well, first of all, welcome to everybody. Some familiar faces and some new folks coming out this afternoon. My name is Stephen Taranto, and I am the coordinator of CISA's Climate Program. This is a new program, a new position that I started a year ago. And a year ago, if all of you painfully recall, we were dealing with a lot of water and probably a lot of ditches, some of which worked and some of which didn't work. And it was then that we decided that this might be an area that CISA could provide some support to farmers around, given what the projections are for precipitation going forward. And so over the last year, we've been talking with a lot of people, learning what we can. And one thing that we've discovered is that ditches are a really complicated issue. So we hope that today's event will shed some light on some of these different aspects of ditch management, which we know can take place on one farm alone, but often takes place across many farms and other land uses. And that's one of the things that makes it so complicated. So we have a great trio of presenters today who are going to share with us some of their knowledge and their experience. And I would like to sort of round that out by saying that going forward, if any of you come away from today's event thinking, I need help with my ditches, I need to know more about ditches, please do not hesitate to get in touch because that's one of the areas that CISA and our presenters are all available in one way or another to provide information, research, contacts, and so forth as you address some of your ditch management and maintenance issues. I'd also like to quickly point out that this is our last event this year of a series that CISA sponsored or hosted as part of our climate program that was focused on water issues in particular, having too much water, having not enough water. And every year we're going to be choosing a different theme. We're open to suggestions. What are your burning concerns as farmers addressing changing precipitation and temperature patterns? So please reach out to us if you have themes, topics that you would like to learn more about and that you think other farmers and technical service providers could benefit from learning more about as well. So the door's open for your ideas and your needs. I also wanted to just, if you didn't realize this already, this event is being recorded. We have had already inquiries from folks who could not attend to be able to view the recording. If you prefer not to appear on the camera, of course, you're welcome to keep your video off, but that is something that we will be sharing eventually to folks who couldn't be here. Also, we have Molly with us. Molly, do you want to just say hi real quick?
Sure. Hi, Molly. I am a new program assistant with CISA. So I'll be helping coordinate anything. Just please chat me if you have any questions for the presenters or having any issues, any technical difficulties. Thanks so much for being here.
Great. And so you can be putting your questions that you might have in the chat. There'll be some open question and answer time when you can just raise your hand and ask your question. And we did receive several questions ahead of time from folks who are here tonight. So we'll be calling on those as well. So I think that's everything that I need to go over before we get started. And so our presenters tonight, we have Kate Parsons, Manuel Diaz-Gonzalez, and Scott Jackson. And I'm going to actually ask each of them to briefly present themselves and the work that they do before they launch into the information they'll be sharing with us. And we're going to kick it off with Kate Parsons from the NRCS. So Kate, welcome and thank you. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes,
famous first line of Zoom world for the last 2 years. So yeah, Kate Parsons with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. I have played many different roles. Title is resource conservationist. My primary duties are serving as the agronomist for NRCS, so providing support to our conservation planners, who are the ones most working firsthand with the farmers and forest landowners in the state. So providing assistance with grazing, soil health, and other things of that nature. Kind of a secondhand duty is doing some of our wetland compliance work, and that's what's bringing me to this talk today. So I'll kind of jump right into that now. I'm sure some of you might be new to the word swamp buster, but I'm going to give you a little introduction here to it, because it is an important part if you're working with the USDA. So, my timer. Okay, so my objective today is to explain what to do if you want to maintain or improve drainage on your property and remain compliant with the swamp buster regulation of the 1985 Food Security Act. And so why is this important? It's important because if you receive benefits from the USDA or want to receive them in the future, this is required. So, the kind of the legislative authority that Swamp Buster is working under is the Food Security Act of 1985 that I just mentioned. It would be known as the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill that was passed in 1985. And this is the Farm Bill that first introduced highly erodible land requirements, HEL, maybe some of you have heard of that, and wetland compliance. So what I've been calling Swamp Buster. So basically, Congress passed this law back then as a result of, seeing a lot of erosion on the landscape across the entire country. A lot of wetlands being converted to crop production at maybe an alarming rate. And kind of a side note is I think grain prices were low at this time. So this was also a way to kind of rein in excessive production to control the price, improve the price a little bit, while at the same time protecting the environment. So we go back to 1985 and it's been amended several times since. So to maintain eligibility, USDA participants must certify that they have not produced crops on converted wetlands after December 23rd, 1985. And also they amended the rules after November 23rd, 1990, that they didn't convert a wetland to make agricultural production possible. So it was like back between 85 and 90, you had to plant the crop to kind of be out of compliance. But after 1990, so like anything today, if you convert a wetland and it's possible to produce an agricultural crop, then that's considered a violation. You don't even have to go ahead and plant the crop. So you might be wondering, well, am I even a USDA participant? So yes, you are if you receive benefits through most of the Farm Service Agency programs. So FSA, I'm sure you've heard of FSA. They do loans and disaster payments and other price support programs, and most NRCS programs. So I'm sure you've heard of high tunnels. We pay for those. That's part of EQIP. You're a participant. CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program. If you're receiving funding for the APR program through the state, most of that has half federal dollars. So you're a USDA participant through most all NRCS programs. I think we have one kind of the quote irrigation, one of the irrigation ones, AMA, that is not required with these rules. But so hopefully that answers if you're a USDA participant or not, or if you hope to be in the future. So how does the USDA know that you're compliant with Swamp Buster or the highly erodible land? Well, at least once when you sign up, you will be filling out a AD 1026 form. This is the highly erodible land and wetland conservation certification. It's filed at the Farm Service Agency. So you say you filled it out 5 years ago. Typically that holds until maybe they update the form or update the Farm Bill. And it's continuous certification unless something has changed. So for example, if you're like, hey, I want to put in a ditch, I've got a lot of excess of water on these fields, well, you would need to update your form to be accurate. or if you're gonna plow up a hayfield that's always been a hayfield, you would need to recertify this for your highly erodible land. So like I said here, I want to modify my drainage. Do I update my AD 1026? Yes. So I think you'll get a handout, this form as a handout. You can also just Google it. But there's the particular questions are, 7 here. Has anyone performed? And you see it says since December 23rd, 1985. Or will anyone perform, in the future here? New drainage systems, conduct land leveling, filling, dredging, land clearing, or excavation that hasn't been evaluated by NRCS. So if you want to put in a new ditch or you want to put in some tile, you fill out this form with the Farm Service Agency marked yes. 7B here, improve or modify an existing drainage system. So same deal, that requires review. So this is that 1026 form that I've introducing here. So if you're going to do either of those, then you kind of indicate, well, what is the activity? Okay, yeah, I want to put a new ditch in, and hopefully you provide a map of where it is. I want to put tile in such and such field, and then what's the current land use? But so this is your way of notifying USDA, hey, I'm a participant, or I want to continue to be eligible in the future. Let me make sure what I'm doing is going to be allowed. So you kind of notify us through this form. And if you're just cleaning out a ditch, there's a separate part for it. That doesn't require a certified wetland determination, but we still take a look. So this is just kind of the language here of maintaining a ditch. Okay, so the 1026 form will prompt NRCS to, okay, so just for maintenance here, to investigate as-built for the drainage system and determine the ditch capacity, because people are allowed to maintain that same hydrologic condition that was originally in place, as long as that drainage system was installed before 1985. Okay, so I just wanted to go through an example here to try to make it easy to follow here. So producer completed the form, the AD 1026, indicating that they'd like to dig some ditches. So these are new ditches, as shown on this map, to improve growing conditions. So we got 2 ditches here shown in blue that they were hoping to dig. They filled out the 1026, indicating that's what they wanted to do. So that gave NRCS the authority to go and to do a wetland determination using the established protocol that were approved in the Food Security Act. And so we decide what's a wetland, yes and no. So the yeses are determined to be wetlands according to the USDA protocol, and the no's are not. So then we get to labels. So what was not a wetland, obviously, pretty straightforward, becomes an NW, non-wetland. And then the wetlands have different labels based on the criteria that Congress basically approved back in 1985. So you can imagine they had some grandfathering in it. And so I'm going to go over the pertinent labels here that you might encounter in the future if you decide to do some drainage. So NW and PC, prior converted cropland, and I think I have a slide for, yeah. So the PC, these were green areas were yeses, so they were wetlands, and the pink was not. And so the non-wetland here, NW, pretty straightforward, areas that don't meet the USDA wetland definition. There's no use limitation, so you can do what you want with an NW. However, you do still need to exercise caution when installing or maintaining drainage systems so that neighboring wetlands aren't inadvertently drained. So if you get a non-wetland, if you have a question, if you're too close to a wetland, then you just, talk to us about that. The prior converted are the ones, like I said, it is still a wetland at this time, but it was converted to cropland before December 23rd, 1985. And this date, specific date, is when they passed the Food Security Act. So the kind of criteria for prior converted, and just to see, this is what you guys are kind of hoping to get, is that it had an agricultural commodity, had been produced at least once before the magical date in 85. And as of December 23rd, 85, the area was still capable of producing an ag commodity. So basically it hadn't been let go and grown back up to woods or shrubs or whatnot. Now you might be asking, what do you mean by agricultural commodity? It's any crop planted and produced by annual tilling of the soil, including tilling by one-trip planters or sugarcane. So examples: corn silage, small grains, annual vegetables, and things that are not considered agricultural commodities, more the perennial nature: Christmas trees, blueberries, apples, cranberries, because they're not perennial crops. So if your only crop before 85 was an apple orchard, you're not eligible for this prior converted designation. So to determine if an ag commodity was grown before 1985, we look at all the historical imagery that we have available. So this is showing the 1985. This is showing some corn in this picture here. And so we see it has an ag commodity before 85, before December 23rd, and that it's also open. And down below here, this is just showing hay, the white, maybe tilled ground, but doesn't show that an agricultural commodity is growing here. And in looking at all the previous years, there wasn't evidence of that annual crop. So these areas would not have that ag commodity history. So what is allowed on the prior converted? The drainage systems or other hydrologic manipulations may be maintained or even improved. So it's kind of, you're allowed to do what you want. Again, just being cautious about neighboring wetlands not being impacted. So just to get to those, kind of finish this one up, the areas that did not have the ag commodity history are going to be labeled farmed wetland pasture, where there was wetland. And so the farmed wetland pasture, basically it was managed for pasture hay before that date, but there wasn't an ag commodity. So that's why it's not getting the prior converted. And as of that date, it also didn't support woody vegetation. And then it also can't be abandoned. So abandonment means 5 consecutive years of no management or maintenance related to crop or forage production. And so and you can have a copy of these slides after, but. So what is allowed on farmed wetland pasture? So the drainage systems may be maintained. So they be maintained to their original capacity to maintain that original hydrologic regime. You can grow crops on them, you can grow annually tilled crops on them, but you just can't improve the drainage. So you can see, because it wasn't kind of grandfathered in with that ag commodity history, it's just maintaining that original level. Unfortunately, you can't improve the drainage on those fields. And wetland, you can imagine, meets our definition of a wetland, and typically would be, when it was on sites that have been abandoned. They were either abandoned in 1985 or they, growing up to kind of woody shrubs at this point. So you can see in the picture here, this whole area was wetland and kind of reverting to shrubland here. So got the W label. Now, wetlands can be farmed if you can farm them naturally, as long as you're not modifying the drainage or removing woody vegetation, or if normal tillage doesn't cause the conversion. So I'm gonna kind of wrap this up so it kind of full circle here in a minute. So the ditch, the request, as you remember, there was the 2 blue lines that they wanted to dig. So you see all the non-wetland, this whole upper area was what had that cropping history. So that's why we had prior converted. So they could put a ditch right through it. They could put a ditch right through this prior converted. But it's not, a new ditch would not be allowed adjacent to the farmed wetland pasture or the wetland area. So you see down here, remember, we didn't have that crop history. So we got the farmed wetland pasture label, and you can only maintain drainage on those. So unfortunately, the ditch wouldn't be allowed as it goes by the farmed wetland part. Same thing over here. We have this big wetland area here. So that ditch along the wetland wouldn't be allowed, unfortunately, because it would be affecting the wetland. And you're not allowed to improve drainage in the wetland areas. So we do have an exemption. It's not a very large amount, and I'm paying attention to my time here. So upon request, we may grant a participant an exemption to convert a wetland through an action that has a minimal effect on the functions and values of the wetland and also the wetlands in the watershed. So it must be smaller than 1/3 of an acre and must qualify as having a minimal effect on that wetland and the wetlands in the watershed, like I mentioned. So it's not a guarantee. So in our example here, Manuel, my colleague that's going to go here in a minute, evaluated this ditch and found that it had approximately a 71-foot effect, a lateral effect. So the producer applied or requested for a minimal effect to basically impact this wetland, this farmed wetland pasture. It's considered a wetland. So that minimal effect was 3/10 of an acre. Yeah, so as the ditch went by this farmed wetland part and this farmed wetland part, basically we approved the minimal effect, and so then that ditch was allowed to be constructed as planned. Whoops, I said that, yeah, the western ditch was allowed, this one was not. You couldn't minimal effect that much area. They only had that 1/3 of an acre. So this is kind of just going over the process. In this example here, so 14B, you can see it ended up farmed wetland pasture. So no crop history before 1985. So it didn't get the prior converted designation. So they could only maintain drainage in this area. They couldn't put tile in this area. If they wanted to install tile drainage to intercept some seeps in this 13A, you see it's all non-wetland. So that would be allowed. And say they did put tile in, they could have a solid pipe to outlet the water, going under the farmed wetland pasture, because it wouldn't be impacting that. Just kind of that same site, here's a ditch that goes through. It's a historical ditch. They wanted to clean this out. So this would be allowed since it's non-wetland. And you see they got the farmed wetland pasture areas just off to the side, so you wouldn't be able to deepen it. But even if it was farmed wetland pasture right up to that ditch and it was a historical ditch, they're allowed the right to maintain that capacity. And just one other example here, all non-wetland, a small prior converted or a small wetland was observed, and they want to tile this out so that they can grow crops in that area. Well, it had an ag commodity before 85, so they got their prior converted, so that would be allowed. And just got a minute left here. So unfortunately, the converted wetland designation is like an example here. A producer has a wet pasture that never had an ag commodity crop history prior to 85. They installed tile or ditches, just throw a date out, in 2020. to improve drainage. So the area would now be considered a converted wetland that was formerly farmed wetland pasture. So this is a situation that's not allowed, and that person would be ineligible for USDA benefits unless they restored it. FSA kind of deals with, well, it's the year is determined, and that would determine when they're, as of what point they're ineligible. And I think I'll stop here because this kind of pertained to the, to the questions that were sent in, and I can come back to that slide later on if we want. So I'll let Manuel take over from a technical standpoint.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. That was great. While Manuel's getting set up, we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has questions from the audience, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so feel free to unmute and ask Kate any questions you have. I'll give a few more seconds while we're transitioning in case anyone does have a question, but if not, we can move on to Manuel. Thanks, Kate.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a variety of old ditches, all over, very old, probably from the 40s and 30s and all over. So I'm basically not allowed to make them deeper, but I can clean out, you know, small little trees that are grown in there, little shrubs and logs and debris that's for some reason fallen in there, branches. We could just clean that out and let the water continue to flow from these areas.
Yeah, from our perspective. And if you had an ag commodity on each side of those ditches, perhaps you could deepen them.
I don't know, I have hay on both sides of them.
Okay, always just hay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a collection of I would have to call wetlands that's up there, and I would have to say it's probably a vernal pools, a variety of them, and if I don't let that water go out of there, it everywhere is wet. It becomes on there.
Yeah, you can. And actually, I just want to say one last thing, because the slide I skipped was that our wetland determinations and our rules are just for us. So the local Concom and the State Wetlands Protection Act, like you have to also deal with them as well, or the Army Corps.
What do you mean, local conservation?
Yeah, because we only speak for the Swamp Buster. We keep you in compliance with Swamp Buster if you want to participate with us. But from a local Concom perspective, you have to work with them.
Really?
And Stephen Jackson, I think, is going to speak to that in a little bit. Scott, sorry.
So you go to the local conservation commission and they would come out and look at our ditch. Is that the deal?
I'll let Scott speak to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because I only know the federal side.
All right. So because I have a river that runs through our farm, and the ditch runs to that river, so it's just a natural flow of all the water on the land draining to the river, the Manhan River.
Oh yeah.
And then I have another ditch that's been there when we were little kids. We used to ice skate on it when it froze in the winter, and the city raised the height of the road, so now the water doesn't go down the ditch. No.
Yeah.
Did they get a conservation permit for that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Probably not.
I know. Okay,
Yep.
I'm done.
Challenging things.
Very good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. And I'd like to just introduce Manuel Diaz Gonzalez from the NRCS in Amherst. So Manuel, if you could quickly introduce yourself and then get started with what you'll be sharing.
Let me make sure I'm set up here. Yes, welcome to a quick overview on the plan, design, and maintenance of existing drainage ditches. From an engineering point of view, I am Manuel Diaz Gonzalez. I am an agricultural engineer with the USDA NRCS in Amherst, Massachusetts. In the next 20 minutes, I will do my best to empower you to grasp the concepts needed for you to identify the problems with existing drainage ditches and effectively plan and design a way to bring them to an efficient form, taking into consideration the obstacles that you may face. Along the way, we will see concepts that are also applied to the planning and design of new ditches. Just like Kate, what I will be talking to you about will be from the NRCS standpoint, and you will have to see with the State and Conservation Commission and anybody else involved about everything else. Excuse me, I'm having some technical difficulty here. For some reason, one of my views disappeared. 1 second. There we go. Now, so I want to break the ice about what expectations I feel customers bring to me versus what they have. So when a farmer or any customer, it doesn't have to be a farmer, any private landowner come up to me, I feel like they sort of expect something that looks like this. Something that has a wide bottom, have stable slopes. It is fairly steep, so water flows out fast, and it looks just beautiful. Now, when I visit their farm, they have something that looks more like this. There is woody vegetation, there is a flat channel, there is debris, and the bed is heavily sedimented. Often there is not, you can barely tell that there is a channel. So you can tell where my point is going there. You know, from my point of view, the first thing is managing expectations on a project. You might wonder, what this guy come from? You know, how does he know about ditches, or what kind of qualifications does he have to talk to us about ditches? Well, in my previous life as an engineer in the Pacific Northwest, I worked with many miles of irrigation ditches and terraces. Just in the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, I was the lead engineer in the cleaning and maintenance of 420 miles of irrigation canals. And then in Idaho, in Oneida County, I was the lead engineer on the installation of about 7 miles of terraces. Terraces are like drainage ditches, but in the opposite. Instead of taking water away from your farm, you want the water to infiltrate and stay on your farm. Those terraces were big. They were up to 60 feet wide and 5 feet deep. So when I see ditches here in Massachusetts that are about 6 feet wide and 6 inches deep, I'm not intimidated. Now, along the way, it is my goal during this webinar to expose you to the basic concepts of planning, design, and maintaining ditches. I will begin by going over some historical perspective of ditches in Massachusetts. Then I will dive into the planning and design of an existing ditch. As I mentioned, some of those concepts do overlap with a new ditch. And then I will briefly talk about the maintenance of existing ditches. Disclaimer, math is involved. Like Kate said, and many of you have already mentioned or will may imagine, often regulation does not allow you to expand the capacity of your ditch. So we need to determine or sort of guess what the capacity was at the very beginning, and that requires some modeling and some math. So from a historical standpoint, ditches have been around for a long time. Most of the ditches that I see were built between the 30s and 60s. There are far more ditches than anybody, at least me that work with this every day. Well, not every day, but almost every day. I am surprised. For instance, just Cape Cod has about 15 miles of drainage ditches. And Hadley probably have that or more. From an engineering perspective, I am really amazed about how drainage ditches were built in Massachusetts. These people would build them using primitive instruments. And today, we cannot build them as good as they did back in the 30s. Something that I see very often is that lack of maintenance have taken the ditches to such state that if we could get away with it, which I'm not saying we should, it will be easier to build them new than to maintaining them. Here is a shaded elevation view of a roughly 1 mile by 1 mile view of an area in Hadley. As you may imagine, this is a highway, this is a river, and here is a ditch, a ditch, a ditch, 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 more ditches, and I go on because there are so many per square mile in many places. Now, that ditch there, in red, or that line right there in red, represents the same ditch that Kate Parsons used as an example, which I will use in a few minutes. I present this to you for you to know the complexity of building a new ditch or maintaining a ditch, taking into consideration everything that is downstream and upstream from that feature. Now, not everybody is an engineer, and not everyone is exposed to all this. So I want to start by introducing you to 3 concepts that anyone who wants to engage with a ditch needs to have. So let's say you want to drain your farm and you envision a series of ditches that will go along. So the first thing that you need to check is the slope. Do you have enough pitch, or do you have too much pitch? Sometimes we can work with slopes that are 1% to 4%. That is 1 foot every 100 feet to 4 feet every 100 feet. When this slope is more than that, then we need to look at ditches that are across the slope instead of going down slope. Also, when the ditch itself, the channel or the bed is steeper than that, then velocities may get too high, and you will need to consult with an NRCS conservationist or engineer to check if that ditch will become an issue with erosion, for instance. The second thing that you need to look is at the soils. When we are draining, most people think about shallow groundwater. They want to lower the water table so they can access their fields. Not everyone, but often that's what I see. In fact, recently, multiple customers have made a comment that goes along these lines. Yeah, right, I want to drain my field in the spring so I can water it in the summer. I am not sure yet what to make about that, but I have heard it multiple times in the last in just this growing season. So yes, we want to look at soils. We want to look at soil texture. You know, do we have is our soil texture uniform, like a sandy soil, or if there is a perch layer there, like a clay or a heavy soil that is perching our water table above it? Can we break through that layer and whatnot? But soils is a very important consideration, and I will go a little bit deeper in a couple of slides. The last thing that you need to do, and you must, is field observations. You need to go out there and observe where the water is going. In fact, the best time to do this is after a heavy rain and in the wettest part of the spring. We want to see where water is going. The lack of maintenance of ditches in the state sometimes is such that the water intended to reach them no longer gets there, and it gets diverted. The gentleman, the person who spoke before, mentioned how a road was built increasing some kind of elevation, and water doesn't drain where it used to. So that can be applied to many other situations in the state. Moving on to a greater view. So we started with 3 factors. I want to expand them now to 5. Again, we want to look at soils. We want to look at slope. We want to look at the sizing of the ditch, whether you are building a new one, whether you're allowed to make it bigger, or whether you're just providing maintenance to one. By sizing, I mean the width, the depth, the side slopes, and any berms that may be built or needed or not. The layout. Often the layout is given because it is an existing ditch, or because the customer or farmer already have an idea for convenience. Sometimes we're able to lay out the ditch system in an efficient way with some heavy science and engineering behind it. And then the outlet. The outlet, last but not least, sometimes needs to be first, is super important. In fact, I speculate that 4 of every 5 projects that I see, the limiting factor is the outlet. And we need to make sure that we have a suitable, legal, and safe outlet. And by all that, I mean that have enough pitch, that we can divert the water in that direction, that we're not providing pollutants and sediment and whatnot. So I am now going to expand in each one of those concepts. But before I get there to an example, I want to let you know that anyone can do this. Anyone can do the planning and design of a drainage ditch. What you need is a shovel, a laser level, which you can rent or you can borrow, because we need to know the elevations and the pitch or the slope. We need a tape measure, like a pocket tape measure, and we need a long tape measure. There are a few tools readily available online that we can use. And in fact, I'll be going over them in this example. One is Mass Mapper. If you haven't been at Mass Mapper, go to that webpage right after this, because it's the coolest thing that Massachusetts has come in my opinion, in recent times for planning. You can find a ton of maps there that are really cool for planning. We're going to need source information from the Web Soil Survey. We can use Google Earth, and we will use StreamStats. StreamStats is a statistical analysis tool that the USGS provided to estimate flow. So back to that image from before. We want a ditch right there, and we know that that ditch is a new ditch in this case, and that we will drain into another drainage ditch. And that is a representation of that other drainage ditch. The next thing that we will do is get an aerial picture, because we get a vertical view, or it is easy, at least for me, to visualize things in a macro scale. We sort of draw where we want our ditch, we sort of draw the outlet, and then we, like Kate said, we look if there are map wetlands around it. And in this case, there are. That map wetland comes from Mass Mapper. Now, like Kate mentioned, how we are affecting the wetlands has a lot to do with the proximity to that between the ditch and the wetland. And a physical, even when we have maps, sometimes a physical determination of wetland boundary is still needed, where soils and distance are the main factors to determine how that wetland actually affects the whether your ditch is draining that wetland or not. In this case, there are about 240 feet between the proposed ditch and the wetland. The next thing is to check if we're actually draining the wetland. Someone that does not have deep knowledge in soil water dynamics may speculate that 240 feet actually will be draining the adjacent wetland. But let's dive into it. The first thing that we need to know is our soils. In this case, the mapped soil unit is a Walpole sandy loam. And that Walpole is mapped as mucky pit on the top in the surface, which, as Kate said, is part of wetland soils. And then sandy loam down to 21 inches. And curiously enough, below the fine sandy loam, there is gravelly loam and gravelly sand. In fact, I did a core sampling, which is outside of the scope of this, but for a different situation, I did a core sampling, a geological investigation at this site, and I was amazed to find how the huge hydraulic conductivity of the gravel below. Basically, if we put a well there, it will produce an unimaginable amount of water, but we want to drain the water from the surface. We could talk about that another time, but that was pretty exciting to find. Back to soils and what we're looking for. We're looking for restrictive features. basically, do you have till? Do you have whether it's thin till, thick till, or a plow pan? Any layer that is perching the water table above a certain level. In this case, the web soil survey indicates that there is no restrictive feature within 80 inches. Then we want to speculate about how well drained it is, which looks to be poorly drained, and the runoff classification very fast, which means that when it rains, water does not infiltrate as easily and actually runs off. Most importantly, the web soil survey indicates that the water table is about 4 inches for the surface. Guess what? That's why the farmers or the customers want to drain it. Next. We want to determine if those soils and that distance will translate into a lateral effect that will drain the wetlands. Some complicated modeling can get into this, but the first thing that you could do is contact your local soil conservationist or me or an engineer to look up the Massachusetts Drainage Guide and let you know what is the spacing given in that drainage guide for ditch installation. In that drainage guide, the typical spacing for ditch installation is 35 to 100 feet, which is an indicator, not a measurement, of how far away we can be from a feature without draining it. Our National Engineering Handbook, which is the lead document that NRCS engineers use for design, state that the influence between a ditch and any area is between, or the lateral effect to be explicit, is between 30 and 100 feet. As Kate said, I modeled this location and came up with the lateral effect being 71 feet. So based on this information, it is unlikely that that ditch will be draining the adjacent wetland, which, I wouldn't call 250 feet adjacent, but for this example, we are. Then you want to, if you are doing some permitting or you're challenging FSA or NRCS about the drainage, you want to identify the extent to where that lateral effect is taking place. So it's a so it is a visual representation of it, and anyone can tell that it is far away from the wetland. So the next bullet that I want to hit is the slope. The slope can be determined with the laser level. It can be with a GPS survey, which the NRCS has, or it can be with LiDAR. In this case, I decided to show you using an Excel graph instead of CAD or anything else, just to show you that anyone can do this. You do not need like sophisticated software to calculate some of these things. So I plot my laser level elevations and distance with a tape measure on Excel and came up with this slope from the beginning of the ditch, of the proposed beginning of the ditch to the end of the ditch, and I determined that the pitch is 1.8%. Now, the ditch will be excavated, and let's say that we excavate at the beginning, it's excavated 1 foot all the way out to the outlet. Then the pitch will be 0.9%, let's just call it 1%. 1% is about the minimum pitch that you want to have. Anything less than 1% pitch will require heavy maintenance, like mowing. In other states that burning is allowed, burning the ditch, and even chemical treatment, which I am not encouraging. Moving on. Even when we are dealing, we typically want to drain, in my opinion, or in my experience, farmers and customers want to drain shallow groundwater, we must take into consideration surface water and the watershed above that ditch. This applies whether it's for maintenance or for a new ditch. In this case, I use StreamStax, which is a readily available USGS online interface to determine the size of the watershed and the possible flow that we want to manage, which is the minimum storm. The minimum storm is a 2-year, 24-hour event. Because the watershed is so small, StreamStat does not become a legally binding document. The information that you get from there should not be used for legal purposes, but it's still a really good estimate. And for everyday use, it's fine. So that 2-year storm in this case is a 5.5 CFS or about 2,500 gallons per minute. So we are managing a lot of water. This ditch just became a surface drainage ditch to drain surface water more than groundwater, because water will flow there regardless. When there's an event, water will go there. So we better manage it. So here's when the math come about. Molly, please let me know when I'm approaching my 20-minute mark. I have no ability to look at clocks from my.
You're fine. You can feel free to take your time to wrap up, but I think you are approaching I think we gave you until 4:55, so you're right up about to that time.
Okay, I don't have much time left. Okay, so about the math part, this image that you see here comes from a very handy software called Hydraulics Formula. Hydraulics Formula is a free online USDA downloadable, I meant to say, USDA software that you can use to calculate simple hydraulic stuff. So we know that the channel slope is about 0.9%. Manning's friction factor is the roughness of the channel. You just use the default value, and we want a capacity that is at least 5.5 CFS cubic feet per second, and we want our velocity to be low. When the velocity is less than 5 feet per second, our channel will likely be non-erosive, so erosion is unlikely to happen. When velocities are 5 to 8 feet per second, then we need to take care of erosion, and we need to reinforce that channel. If you have a really steep channel and velocities are above 8 feet per second, you call an engineer because you're going to need assistance. So the minimum bottom width is 1 foot, because that's typically the minimum that a machine can install or clean. Our side slope needs to be at least 2 to 1, 2 horizontal to 1 vertical to be stable. Farmers often want them to be steeper than that, but they become unstable. 1.5 feet seems just like a pretty number for a channel. And I just see it often and I keep designing for it. And that comes to a surface width or a footprint of about 7 feet. Often customers think that is too much and they want to make it smaller, but there is not really a way to make a channel smaller than that under the given conditions. So the outlet, in this case, the outlet is at elevation 93.5. And we want our outlet to be at least 1 foot above that, above the receiving waterway. So our water actually somewhat drops in the waterway, and when that waterway floods, it doesn't backflow or backflood our field. In this case, this is a layout of the receiving waterway, where our elevation is right there at 93.5, and that is the pitch or the surface that a new ditch will need to be excavated to receive water from our ditch. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say new ditch. The existing ditch will need to be excavated to receive water from the new ditch that we are planning to install. So as you can tell, the receiving waterway will need to be lowered by about 1 foot for a length of almost 1,200 feet. And I see these quite often. So these projects just became quite unfeasible. Now, is this even possible? Well, it is, because the original canal is actually sedimented about 1 foot. So we could legally, for the most part, I believe, with regular maintenance, excavate that channel 1 foot and remove the foot of siltation, sedimentation that you can see my foot there and my shovel. And make it work back again. But the cost of this will be huge. And in fact, the customer abandoned this project. So just a couple more slides and I'll be done. We look at a lot of stuff. There are tons of things I didn't talk to you about today that we do consider in the NRCS about ditches. I do want to tell you about maintenance real quick. Often you need machines to maintain ditches that haven't been providing any maintenance in 30 or 40 years. In this case, we use a small dozer to literally plow forward the ditch, and it actually worked. But often just a relatively small to medium mower attached to a tractor will do the trick. That looks like a really well-maintained ditch. I believe that one is maintained by the town, and probably because it costs a lot of money. And I bet that most ditches in the state, or at least the one I see, they haven't been maintained in a while because it costs money to do it. I cannot provide you with a specific amount because every project is unique, but I invite you to contact the NRCS when you have issues and you need a plan or a design, and I look forward to work with you in the future. Thank you. And I don't know if Molly wants to open for questions.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Manuel. We are a little short on time, so we'll just go to one question. We just got a question from Sue from UMass Extension. What practices can farmers do to prevent this sedimentation? Is it just a matter of more routine maintenance, or should there be some perennial plants along the ditch to prevent erosion? What do you recommend?
Yes, a buffer is the best, but often these ditches are installed in the middle of the field where they crop. So cover crops, contour farming, smaller ditches that buffer also help. Again, it's case by case, it depends on the farm, but those are definitely applied to almost everywhere. Contour farming, cover crops, and buffers, riparian buffers, if that is a possibility. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. All right, Scott, are you ready to share screen?
Yep, all set.
Great. All right, take it away.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. And my name is Scott Jackson, and I'm an extension professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation at UMass Amherst. And my expertise is in wetland science and wildlife biology and general natural resource conservation. I'm not an expert on drainage or ditches or ditch maintenance, but I have done a lot of workshops on the exemption to the Wetlands Protection Act for agriculture. And so that's what I'm going to cover this afternoon. I'm going to cover it generally, but I'll try to pay a little bit more attention to issues related to water, such as ditches and ponds. So this is language from the Wetlands Protection Act statute itself. The provisions of this section shall not apply to the maintenance of drainage and flooding systems of cranberry bogs, to work performed for normal maintenance or improvement of land and agricultural use or aquacultural use. And so that's where the exemption comes from, directly from the statute. The rationale for why there is an exemption in a wetlands protection law for agriculture and forestry is the value of those activities for the citizens of Massachusetts. Recognizing that farming and forestry require active relationship with soil and water. Certain activities are necessary to support existing agriculture and harvesting, production and harvesting, and there's a need to avoid a regulatory burden for those ongoing operations. Back in 1996, this guidance document was produced and released to provide more detailed information about the exemption under the Wetlands Protection Act, and I highly recommend it for you. And I provided Stephen with a PDF that he can make available to you as well. So I'm going to talk about aquaculture primarily. I'm not going to talk so much about aquaculture. There's important language in that exemption language that I provided you before. There's some important terms that need to be carefully defined. So I'm going to define these terms going forward. First, land and agricultural use. What does that mean under the Wetlands Protection Act? It means land that's presently and primarily used for the production and raising of agricultural commodities. And under the Wetlands Protection Act, agricultural commodities is different than what was defined for Swamp Buster. So it includes things like apples and blueberries and other agricultural commodities. It has to be agriculture for commercial purposes. So this differentiates it from backyard gardens and things like that. Land can lay fallow for up to 5 years. And it includes land and agricultural use includes the land itself that's in production, as well as any necessary and related land that is needed in order for those farm operations to go forward. So access roads, farm structures, composting areas, field edges, etc. One important distinction here is that for commercial purposes and the idea of production or raising of commodities. So the keeping of horses does not fall under this definition. The raising of horses for sale for commercial purposes would be covered under this, but just the keeping of horses is not covered by the agricultural exemption. Work is the activity that is exempt, not the land. So it's not that agricultural land is exempt from the Wetlands Protection Act. It's routine maintenance and improvement of agricultural land that's exempt. Another term that's there is normal maintenance and improvement. So normal means customary or in general use. It doesn't necessarily mean best management practices. It means practices that are in general use in Massachusetts. Those practices can result in alterations to resource areas. So that's acknowledged and accepted as part of the exemption. However, those practices must fit the scale and scope of the agricultural operation. So agricultural exemption or the raising of commodities can't be used as a ruse for doing something else for some other purpose. So doing extensive drainage that might lend the land to development, or the digging out of a farm pond that's well into excess of what would be needed for the commodity being produced, would not fit this definition and would not be included under the exemption. Maintenance means practices that keep existing operations in good working order. Means no expansion or of the geographic extent of the work, but that stuff is covered under improvement. So it's maintenance and improvement, but under the definitions, under the regulations, improvement involves change, and there are certain activities under improvement that are different from maintenance. It includes expansion of some activities in bordering land subject to flooding, which are floodplains and buffer zones. But some activities require a USDA NRCS certified conservation plan in order to qualify for the exemption. And I'll mention some of those a little bit later. So some of the general conditions around this exemption are that, and I consider this recapture language. So I didn't mention before, but I also serve as the chair of the Conservation Commission in Whately, which is one of our agricultural towns in the Connecticut River Valley. And so I'm commonly approached by farmers who are asking about what they can and can't do in order to be clear, stay out of trouble. And I welcome that. And what I tell them is, yep, you can clean out your ditches, or yep, you can do whatever it is they're asking. I said, however, there is language that says when it's undertaken in such a manner as to prevent erosion and siltation of adjacent water bodies and wetlands. And the way we interpret this is that if you make a mess of it, we're going to come talk to you. So yes, those are exempt, but be careful. There can be no dredging or filling of salt marsh ever, and no drainage of bordering vegetated wetlands. And there can be no substantial fill deposited in floodplains. And so basically there can be no loss of flood storage capacity in these bordering lands subject to flooding. And it needs to comply with other state and federal laws. So anything that might violate swamp busters would also violate the Massachusetts exemption. But the other thing that's of interest is that the production of cannabis in Massachusetts, while legal in Massachusetts, is still illegal at the federal level. So cannabis production does not qualify as exempt. I should probably qualify that. That's a ruling that we made in Whately when it came up. And so far, nobody has challenged it, but I don't think it's any official policy of DEP or anywhere specifically noted. So examples of exempt activities: repair or replacement of existing access roads. Now note that new access roads are not exempt, but the maintenance of existing access roads is. Maintenance of man-made or natural water management systems. So these might be ditches, farm ponds as well, irrigation ponds. Construction of water management systems. The maintenance of flow of existing waterways. The construction of farm structures less than 4,000 square feet in size. The squaring off of fields and cranberry bogs. Management of existing field edges, and a change in commodity, except for changing forest to some kind of row crop or pasture. Now, most of these are exempt activities when they occur in land already in production, or in some cases, they're allowable if it's within land subject to flooding, in other words, in floodplains, or within the buffer zone, the 100 feet adjacent to lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams, and also bordering vegetated wetlands. So when we talk about management of field edges, we're talking about mowing, burning, brush cutting, and tree removal in order to prevent the shading of agricultural production areas. And this is allowed out to 100 feet from the edges of the field and can extend into wetlands. So you can clear vegetation by mowing, burning, brush cutting, or tree removal, but you can't dig out the stumps or otherwise convert it to agricultural land. But you can't do it within 25 feet of a water body or a waterway unless that's a water body that is already managed in land in production. So in other words, ditches that run through your fields are not counted as these water bodies that require a 25-foot setback. The slash law says you can't store slash within 25 feet of water bodies, so you have to make sure that all of that woody slash is stored somewhere else. And there can be no conversion of bordering vegetated wetland, and so no tilling, no filling, no excavation, or other changes in existing topography. Now, I just want to pause for a minute just to clarify that when we talk about what's allowed and what's not allowed, we're talking about what can and cannot happen within areas that are under the jurisdiction of the Wetlands Protection Act. So again, these are water bodies and waterways, so lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams. They're wetlands that are associated with those water bodies, the floodplains, land within 100 feet of water bodies, waterways, and wetlands, and land within 200 feet of perennial streams and rivers. If you're operating in anywhere outside of those areas, then it's not an exemption, you're just not under the jurisdiction of the Wetlands Protection Act, and you can do your work without any kind of oversight from the Conservation Commission. And then, so these things are like if you are within bordering land subject to flooding, or if you're in bordering vegetated wetland, things like that. So it's important to recognize that this is not meant as a way of converting wetlands to some kind of agricultural use. It's just a way of clearing vegetation to prevent the shading of your agricultural fields. Now, these are some activities that require conservation plans, essentially expansion of existing ponds or reservoirs up to a certain size, an existing dike, tailwater recovery pond, or bypass channel, all up to specific sizes. And these would be exempt if they are as part of an NRCS conservation plan. So there's a whole wide range of things that are exempt, and you could, a list of everything you can do to maintain or improve your agricultural land would be extensive. Sometimes it's more useful to focus on what's not exempt. And so what are the kinds of activities where you would need to first go to the Conservation Commission and get approval? If you're bringing new land into production that is not exempt, that needs to be reviewed by the Conservation Commission if it involves any of those areas that I mentioned. We call them resource areas or areas subject to protection under the Act. If you're reclaiming land that's been fallow for more than 5 years, if there's a change in commodity from forest products to any other commodity, for non-commercial operations. So here again, if it's not a commercial operation, it's not exempt under the Wetlands Act. And then also if it's not involved in the production or raising of commodities, so retail facilities or processing operations are not exempt, only production or raising of commodities. So in some cases like greenhouses that are used for raising crops are exempt, whereas buildings that are used to sort the commodity and package them for shipment or to turn them into jelly or jam, those are not included under the exemption. And as I mentioned before, the construction or expansion of access roads is not exempt and needs to be reviewed by the Conservation Commission if it's within those areas subject to jurisdiction. There is a process under the regulations called limited projects, and limited projects are projects that generally are going to be allowed unless there's an exceptional level of impact to wetlands and water bodies. And so this is just a long list of the same things that I showed you before that require a conservation plan, but these are what exceeded those thresholds that qualify for the exemption. And these would have to be reviewed by the Conservation Commission, but it's likely that they would be approved unless there's some exceptional sensitivity or an exceptional level of adverse impact to those wetlands or water bodies. And the area that we normally have jurisdiction over, called the riverfront area, which is 200 feet from perennial streams and rivers, is actually reduced to 100 feet for agricultural activities. New agriculture, again, is non-exempt activity, but it's still a limited project. So, it gets a lighter review, and the construction or expansion of access roads would also qualify as a limited project. There's also provisions in the regulations for agricultural emergencies. And so their procedures are in a particular part of the wetland regulations, and it's designed to eliminate an imminent threat to land and agricultural use. And the process that's outlined there in 10.06 is called emergency certification. And that's where you can go to the Conservation Commission or go to the chair of the commission, and the chair of the commission can act unilaterally as long as that action is ratified at a subsequent meeting. And that allows the Conservation Commission to act quickly to provide authorization for you to take action to abate an emergency. The work is generally only what is necessary to abate the immediate emergency, and you have to do that work within 30 days of the storm or whatever caused the problem. It can provide an emergency agricultural water source in the case of a loss of water source or drought. And there are some activities that are allowable under these emergency procedures, but with some restrictions. So you'll need to work carefully with the Conservation Commission to understand just what kind of work is authorized by the emergency certificate. All right, now, this is my last text slide. I have some image slides, but it depends on whether we have time, whether we go through those examples or not. But this is often an important question that people raise, and this is, to my best understanding of the situation around municipal bylaws and agriculture. And it dates to a letter that dates back to 1996 from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office to the town of Medway. And in that letter, this is paraphrased a little bit, but it's very close to a direct quote from the letter. The town may adopt a bylaw that is consistent with, but more stringent than the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. However, a town may not adopt a bylaw that is inconsistent with the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. The Massachusetts legislature in Acts of 1991, Chapter 141, Section 2, amended the act, meaning the Wetlands Protection Act, to require that DEP promulgate rules and regulations to establish definitions for the term normal maintenance or improvement of land and agricultural or aquacultural use. And the letter continues to say, the legislature made explicit its intention to preclude local action burdening agriculture. As a result, it's generally been accepted that the agricultural exemption applies to municipal wetland bylaws as well as to Wetlands Protection Act. But it all dates back to this 1996 letter, so it's not obvious. Most people don't even know of this letter. And so it's likely that there will be some confusion or some misunderstanding or some differing opinions if a municipality tries to exercise jurisdiction over agriculture under their bylaw. And so I would just suggest that if it's possible for you to get a copy of the letter, I have a marked up copy that was scanned. I'm happy to share it. But get into a conversation with the Conservation Commission if they try to assert jurisdiction under a bylaw, and let them see for themselves what the opinion of the Attorney General is about that. Okay, I'll pause there and then just ask if you want me to go through the examples or whether you want me to stop for questions at this point.
I think we can open it up to questions. And if we don't have any questions, we could go back to that last bit of content. Does anyone have a question they wanted to pose to Scott? We did have a few questions. We did have a few questions that came in before the event. So I can pose one of these. So one of the questions that we received ahead of time was, is there a way to manage a wet field using or modifying existing ditches to reclaim more dry area if water is backed up from off property, i.e. Increasing depth of ditches to hold more water or digging a pond? You have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, sure. Maintenance of ditches is exempt under the Wetlands Protection Act, provided that they're not deeper or wider than the original ditch. So if you're just maintaining ditches in order to reclaim their water carrying capacity, that would be exempt. If you want to make them deeper or wider to try to carry more water, it would depend on whether you're in land that's under the jurisdiction of the Wetlands Protection Act. If you're outside of that jurisdiction, yes, you can do that. If you are proposing to do it in land subject to flooding or within the buffer zone, there is one of the exempt activities is water management systems, the construction or expansion of water management systems. But what it would not allow you to do is to use it in wetlands, to drain wetlands. And we do not recognize in Massachusetts the idea of farmed wetlands or prior converted wetlands. If they still have wetland hydrology, they are still protected under the Wetlands Protection Act. So you would not be able to ditch through a wetland, even if you've been using it as pasture or hayfield for a while, without approval from the Conservation Commission.
Great, thank you. All right, looks like we have like 2 more minutes. If you'd like to go through some of those examples.
Okay, I'll just do it quickly to try to illustrate some of the very things that I said. So This is an example where, a hayfield, somebody proposes drainage in that hayfield. Some of this drainage would be allowable because it's up away from the wetlands. It might be some of it might be within the floodplain, but that would be acceptable. But the drainage through the wetland itself would not be acceptable without a permit from the wetlands, from the Conservation Commission. Another option here again, pasture, we see the riverfront areas, the floodplain. If the proposal is to put in a shed over here to square off a field there and to install a pond, the shed would be exempt because it's less than 4,000 square feet and it's not within a bordering vegetated wetland or the 100-foot riverfront area. The squaring off of the field would be acceptable as exempt, but the pond would not, because the pond would be in an area that's bordering vegetated wetland. It would be allowable if it was in land subject to flooding. If it was within the agricultural field and you were expanding it, it could be exempt. Here we see management of the field edges. This would be exempt because even though it goes through the wetland, that's allowable as long as you're not tilling the soil, changing the topography, or digging out the stumps. However, where the stream crosses that area, you would need to avoid cutting within 25 feet of that stream. If you were proposing a pond here, that would be acceptable because it's outside of the wetlands and it's outside of the 100-foot riverfront area, and it's allowable within the 100-year floodplain. And then the last one is that a shed here, let's say you want to build a road to the shed. The shed itself would be exempt, but the road would not, because it's a new road, a new access road that would be covered as a limited project, but would still require a filing under the Wetlands Protection Act. And that's it.
Okay.
Okay,
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes,
Yes,
yeah,
please.
we have
Huh?
a couple minutes for a question. Yeah,
Huh?
sure.
On your diagram there, you showed these ponds at different spots here, and
Mhm.
you showed the pond in the wetlands, and that would not be allowable. Is that correct?
It would, excuse me, it would not be allowable if it was not like part of the pasture.
No, in the
So-
wetlands area. And
Right,
in the wetlands, you showed a pond over there
Right.
by the stream.
right.
That would not be allowable.
That would not be allowable without a permit from the Conservation Commission.
Okay, so now if you had a pond there that existed previously,
Mhm.
how much could you expand that pond? Would that be allowable to expand it to cover all the wetlands?
You could expand it. Let's see, I guess I got to go a little ways back here to find it. You could expand it up to 10,000 square feet of the bordering vegetated wetlands. So up to 10,000 feet of the wetland could be allowable if you have a conservation plan from NRCS.
So if you had a pond that was probably, maybe about 6 acres, and it was expanded to 19 acres, would that be illegal?
19 acres would, from 6 to 19, it wouldn't.
Yeah.
It
In
wouldn't
other
be,
words, the wetlands becomes a pond, not a wetlands anymore.
right. I mean, you could only go up to 10,000 square feet, which is less than a quarter of an acre.
Uh-huh. what I thought.
So that's exempt. You could go a little bit above that, but you
No.
you would need to file for that.
I understand. So if someone were doing that, they would have to file that they're doing it.
They would have to file and there would be no guarantee that they would get it. If you were doing
no.
it between 10,000 and 20,000 square feet, it's a limited project, so it's quite likely that you would get permission.
Oh, no.
If you were over 20,000 square feet, then that would likely, that would be uncertain whether you would get that approval or not.
Okay, and you would get that from your conservation.
Right.
Thing there, okay? So if you had a pond that had a stream that ran through it and there was a culvert on that culvert were to become clogged, all right,
Yeah,
I guess, somebody could say there was a beaver dam built in the culvert. I'm not quite sure whether a clogged culvert is a beaver dam on that. Would that be?
yeah, you can clear out your culverts. The thing that I would always say if a farmer came to me and asked me about it, I said, yes, you can clear it out, but do it carefully, do it right, so that you don't cause erosion and sedimentation or flooding of a neighbor's property. So, but the maintenance of existing access ways is exempt. So the
Okay.
culvert would be part of that.
So they could, that could be cleaned out legally and everything. Because basically what I'm talking about is a situation where there are two ponds. The culvert goes in between them to keep them balanced.
Yep.
Because one of the ponds is a source of water with spring water and feeds here, and it feeds the other pond.
Yeah.
And then that pond feeds a brook, which runs into a river on that. So you could clean out that culvert, and then that water would be allowed to flow and continue down through the river, the brick for the stream into the river at a constant flow.
Sorry to
Yes.
interrupt.
What-
I think we're getting just to the end of our time. So
Okay.
so sorry.
Let me just add one qualifier to that, just to wrap up. Is
Yeah, go for it.
assuming it's all part of an agricultural system. So, as long as what that unplugging that culvert is doing is making you able to farm, then it would be exempt. But doing it for any other purpose would not be part of the agricultural exemption.
Well, so just my question here on it is to keep a steady flow through that culvert, through those things, so that you don't have a 19-acre flood zone every time you clean it out. Would that be an agricultural situation?
If you're doing it in order to maintain an agricultural production, yes.
Okay.
It's just that if you're doing it in order to make it possible to build houses, it would be
No.
no.
I'm not wanting no houses. It's just I'm encountering a flooding issue caused by tremendous buildup of water, a release of the water running to the Manhan River, and the stream just backing right up and flooding 19 acres.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just would like to propose that if folks want to stay on a few extra minutes here, we might be able to entertain any more questions that you have if our presenters can stick around. I can stay here as well for that. I also wanted to point out that Molly put a link to our upcoming events in our chat here, and also to our evaluation form. And evaluation forms, they can be a little bit tedious, but they really help us out, and they help us know what you all need from us as an organization. So please take a few minutes to look at that as well. And I'd also like to thank our three excellent information-filled presenters tonight, Scott, Kate, and Manuel. Great to have you. And remember, along with CISA, these folks are places to go for information in one way or another. So I encourage you all who are managing waterways to reach out and find out really what are all the, the things that you need to take in mind. And we can tell from today's presentations that there is quite a lot to consider. So it's great to have all three of you here in our community available to help us answer these questions. And I look forward to working with all of you again in the future. And special thanks to Molly for all the great work she did getting this set up. So thanks, everybody. And we'll be sticking around for a few more minutes if anybody else would like to do that. And we'll see what we can get to in that time. Thank you. John, are you still with us?
I'm here.
All right. Well, I'm not sure, Scott, if you had something more to add to John's question, or John, maybe you were still in the middle of explaining the situation.
Oh, you want me to explain it further?
If there's more you'd like to know.
Basically, we have two large ponds divided by a small road and a culvert that goes under the road. And that culvert